Hey, shalom, 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 lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hayawam tawab la adam za'ach yakam yawam on chagadol Charlotte, which is good day. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya hamalakat hashamayim kwara repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la but now Yahweh bahasham Yahweh shai bahasham rocha kwadash wa mashana la za kwayim nawa wa malaakim sharuch chagadol, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means He exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. Zata Hoyam, this is Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1 in the NLT. And it says, "Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with mockers." Reading it again, it says, "Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with mockers." All right, and ultimately, it's going into, the men of the Lord. All right, because, those that walk contrary, to the scriptures are going to essentially, in the end, ultimately have judgment and destruction to look forward to. Whereas those that are essentially following after the scriptures are going to be in a joyful state. All right, and some of those joys, as we got in the NLT, consists of the stability, the true happiness, because the scriptures say, who is as the wise man, who knoweth the interpretation of a thing. A man of wisdom, roughly paraphrasing, he's going to shine, roughly paraphrasing. That shine comes with happiness. It comes with the mindset of abundance. And again, to reiterate that stability, you see, because those in the world, those that are subscribing to the ways of the world are ultimately, currently are in a state of, not knowing what to do, because wisdom again provides for true stability, whereas wickedness had its season. All right, as the scriptures say, the triumph of the hypocrite is but for a moment, roughly paraphrasing, because they had their season to where wickedness was it seemed as if wickedness was thriving, you see, in which you still have people that are given over into that wickedness, you see, but the ultimate end of that wickedness is in a state of despair, sorrow, all right, and being unstable and uncertain in these times, in which again, those in the world, they essentially subscribe to different ways of life that they that seem beneficial to them in those moments, you see, but ultimately at the end of the night, that tab has to be paid. All right, that's why we're going into Psalms 1 and verse 1. You see, because it says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful." All right, because ultimately that man ultimately is going to be blessed, and as this world starts or continues to be dismantled and crumbled, ultimately the men of the Lord have true stability, and we're in a happy state, because the roles are essentially reversing. All right, whereas again, wickedness was in, righteousness is in. Righteousness is always in. You see it, again, it's just that wickedness had its season. All right, we in a season now to where the Lord is reversing those roles. All right, so let me get a couple precepts. Let's get we'll get Micah chapter 2, and we'll get verse 10. And it says, "Arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest." All right, arise ye and depart. Spiritually, it's not talking about actually carnally. It says, "Arise ye and depart." Depart spiritually from this place. All right, the different various captivities that the elect have been scattered. Essentially, the elect in those different places are rising, all right, upon their feet, all right, and departing from the ways that was not beneficial to life. So it says, "For this is not your rest." The different captivities were not meant to be our rest. All right, when one goes into the mindset of the ways that essentially we was taught, coming up, those ways wasn't beneficial to life, and again, to reiterate, those that are given over to those ways and doctrines and lifestyles, essentially, it seems as if they're winning currently, but again, it's going to be a tab to be paid, you see, because the Lord rewards a man according to the doing. The Lord rewards a man according to his doings. All right, roughly paraphrasing. I'm gonna get a quick precept. This is Psalms chapter 28, and we'll get verse 3. Just going into that point. This is Psalms 28 and 3, and it says, "Draw me not away with the wicked and with the workers of iniquity, which speak peace to their neighbors, but mischief is in their hearts." It says, "Give them according to their deeds and according to the wickedness of their endeavors. Give them after the work of their hands. Render to them their desert." And the Lord is a just power. So if you've been working righteousness, you will receive of a righteous reward. On the contrary, if someone was working wickedness, they're essentially going to receive of a wicked reward. They're going to have destruction and judgment, to their inheritance. All right. So continuing on, let's get Isaiah 52, and we'll get verse 1. Because it said, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, roughly paraphrasing. So it says, awake, awake, put on thy strength, O Zion, put on thy beautiful garments, you see, because the scriptures, they ultimately beautify us, all right? It says, awake, awake, put on thy strength, O Zion. All right. The strength is talking about the scriptures. That's our stronghold, It says, put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For henceforth there shall no more come into thee the uncircumcised and the unclean. So ultimately it starts with this truth, you see, because in the kingdom we're going to be perfected. All right. Right now we're rehearsing the righteous acts, and ultimately those that are rehearsing the righteous acts are going to be those that's going to be in a blessed estate in the kingdom, first go around, So, continuing on, let's get Galatians. We'll get Galatians chapter 5, and we'll get verse 16. And it says, this I say then, walk in the spirit, and ye should not fulfill the lust of the flesh, because again, going into the man that's going to be blessed, he's going to have walked in the spirit, And it was like a old Gadite quote. And essentially it went into, it said, the two beasts, which one's going to win more? And it's the one that, ultimately is fed more. All right. So pretty much going into the scripture right here, Galatians 5 and 16, it says, this I say then, walk in the spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. So if, we are to walk in the spirit, ultimately we're going to receive of the spirit. We're going to receive of life. We're going to receive of that eternal kingdom. Verse 17, it says, for the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. So it's a battle. It says, but if ye be led of the spirit, ye are not under the law. It says, now the works, we're going back up to verse 18. It says, but if ye be led of the spirit, ye are not under the law. You see, because we can't ultimately, keep the whole law. All right. If we're walking after, the things that are going to be advantageous to the spirit, ultimately, we're not putting ourselves under the curse of the law. All right, so reading this, Galatians 5 and 6 or 18, it says, but when you are directed by the Spirit, you're not under the obligation to the law of Moses. All right, so if we're being directed by the Spirit, ultimately, we're going to essentially receive of the spiritual benefits. All right, and again, going into the scripture right here, Galatians 5 and 6 or 18, NLT, it says, but when you are directed by the Spirit, you are not under the obligation to the law of Moses. All right, because again, all right, if we're walking in the spirit, all right, if we are doing the things that we need to do in the spirit, essentially rehearsing the righteous acts, all right, we don't again put ourselves under the being obliged by the law. You see, because scriptures say that if we was to try to keep the whole law, we're indebted to keep the whole law, and we can't keep the whole law. That's why we need a mediator. So we should walk in the spirit. All right, Galatians 5 and 19, it says, now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wraths, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revilings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I have told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of the Most High. So I'll continue on in verse 22. It says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. It says, and they that are Hamashayachs have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. So ultimately the goal is to walk in the Spirit. It says, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. So we should be walking in the Spirit. We should be walking and striving, for perfection. While we're not going to get it perfect, we have grace, through our mediator, Yahweh Shai, Hamashayach, so we should be putting our best foot forward, going back to Psalms 1 and 1. All right, because the man that's being described is the man that's walking in the Spirit. It says, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. All right. It says, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night. So ultimately having the delight in the law of the Lord, the Lord is essentially going to root us, as pursuant to Sirach, the 6th chapter and the 37th verse. All right, but then also that shows true stability. The man that is walking in the ways of the scriptures is going to have true stability. So I just want to go into Psalms 1 and 1 to verse 2. I don't want to Zaza by Naya Apollo as well. That was a beautiful edification to the spirit. Well, I don't want to Zaza. Thumb Yashi Awam Tawab Blue as well. You have a good day. Washalam Lakam, which is peace unto you all. Shalom, shalom.